Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text. Before you hang your next IV bag, I want you to consider something. The antibiotic you're holding right now, it might not actually kill the bacteria inside your patient.
Right. It might just, stall them.
Exactly. And if your patient's immune system isn't strong enough to finish the job, well, that infection is coming right back. So welcome, everyone. If you are a nursing student prepping for an exam or stepping onto the floor for clinicals, you are in the perfect place.
You really are.
This is a specialized deep dive from the Last Minute Lecture team, and our mission today is super specific. We are taking Chapter 88 of Lane's Pharmacology for Nursing Care and basically translating it.
Translating it into plain, student-friendly language. No outside noise.
Right, just the pure core reasoning you need to lock in those safe medication decisions at the bedside. I'll admit, looking at the sheer volume of drugs in this chapter initially, I was completely overwhelmed.
Oh, it's a massive category. I mean, we're tackling modern antimicrobials today. These drugs totally revolutionized medicine back in the 1930s and 40s.
A little game changer.
Absolutely. But we actually need to make a really quick clinical distinction right off the bat. Technically speaking, an antibiotic is a chemical produced by one living microbe to harm another microbe.
Okay.
Whereas an antimicrobial is just any bug killer, natural or synthetic. But honestly, in clinical practice, and pretty much throughout your textbook, you're going to hear those terms used interchangeably.
That makes sense. But before we get into the weeds with specific meds, there is this foundational question. If these chemicals are so incredibly toxic to microbes, why don't they just destroy the human taking them?
Yeah, that's the magic of selective toxicity. Without this, these drugs would be entirely useless to us.
Because we'd just be poisoning the patient.
Exactly. Selective toxicity is the ability of a drug to injure a target cell without injuring the host cells that it's in intimate contact with. And we achieve this by exploiting the biological differences between human cells and bacterial cells.
Okay, so how do we actually do that?
There are three main ways. First, drugs can disrupt the bacterial cell wall.
Wait, human cells don't have rigid walls, right? Like, we just have flexible membranes.
Spot on. Bacteria are encased in this rigid wall, and inside the bacterium is the protoplasm, which is this thick fluid with a massive concentration of solutes.
So the internal pressure must be huge.
It is. The osmotic pressure is extremely high. So basic osmosis means water from the outside constantly wants to rush into the bacterium. If that rigid cell wall wasn't there, the bacteria would absorb the water, swell up, and literally burst.
Oh, wow. So drugs like penicillins?
Penicillins, cephalosporins, yeah. They weaken that wall, which causes bacterial lysis. And since your patient's cells lack walls, they are completely unaffected.
It's like exploiting a massive structural vulnerability. So what's the second method?
The second way is the inhibition of unique enzymes. Think about folic acid. Humans, we get the folic acid we need from the food we eat.
Right, from our diet.
But bacteria can't absorb folic acid from their environment. They have to synthesize it themselves from a precursor chemical. It's called PBA.
Okay, so we target that process.
Exactly. Drugs like sulfonamides block the specific enzyme that converts PABA into folic acid. And because human cells don't use that enzyme at all, the drug just passes right through us.
I love that. It's like having a master key that only fits the enemy's door,
Mm-hmm.
Since we don't make our own folic acid, a drug blocking that process is basically a weapon that's completely invisible to human cells.
That's a great analogy. And the third method relies on the disruption of protein synthesis. Both humans and bacteria use ribosomes to make proteins.
But I'm guessing ours are different.
Very different structurally. So we can administer drugs that bind only to the bacterial ribosomes, halting their function, while our mammalian ribosomes just keep chugging along untouched.
That is so elegant.
Yeah.
So once we understand how they work without harming the patient, how do we even begin to categorize this huge list of drugs in the chapter?
Well, the tables in the book, like 88.1 and 88.2, categorize them in two main ways. First, by mechanism of action, like those cell wall inhibitors we just talked about. And second, by the susceptible organism. So you have narrow-spectrum antibiotics, which are highly targeted against just a few species, and broad-spectrum antibiotics, which wipe out a huge variety of bugs.
Got it. Broad versus narrow.
But as you study these, you absolutely must grasp the difference between bactericidal and bacteriostatic agents. Bactericidal drugs are directly lethal. They kill the bacteria outright.
And bacteriostatic.
Bacteriostatic drugs only slow microbial growth. They don't actually cause cell death directly. When you give a bacteriostatic drug, you are relying entirely on the patient's own immune system, specifically their phagocytic cells, to actually finish the job and clear the infection.
Okay, which brings us right back to that scenario I mentioned at the start of the deep dive. If bacteriostatic drugs rely on the host, what happens when the bacteria learn to fight back against the drugs entirely?
Yeah, this is probably the most critical nursing concept in this entire field, acquired resistance. And you have to remember, it is the microbe that becomes resistant, not the patient.
Right, that's a huge distinction. People always say, oh, I'm resistant to penicillin, but they aren't. The bugs are.
Exactly. And bacteria use 4 main mechanisms to fight back. First, they can reduce the concentration of the drug at the site of action.
How do they do that?
They might decrease their active uptake of the drug, or they actually build efflux pumps.
Wait, like tiny biological sump pumps?
That is exactly what they are. They actively spit the drug back out of the cell before it can even work.
It is terrifying.
It gets worse. Second, they can alter the structure of the target molecules. So they basically change the locks on their ribosomes so the drug can't bind anymore.
Sneaky.
Third, they can produce an antagonist, like synthesizing massive extra amounts of that biochemical to completely overwhelm a sulfonamide block.
Just flooding the system.
Yeah.
And the fourth way?
Fourth, they can directly inactivate the drug by producing drug metabolizing enzymes. The classic example is penicillinase, which is an enzyme that actively chews up and destroys penicillin.
Which brings up a specific massive threat highlighted in the text, the NDM1 gene. I mean, imagine looking at your patient's chart and realizing almost none of the standard IV bags in your medroom are going to work against their infection.
Yeah, NDM1 is a global nightmare. It stands for New Delhi metallo-beta-lactamase 1. It codes for a highly destructive enzyme that inactivates almost all beta-lactam antibiotics. Penicillins, cephalosporins, carbapenems, all useless.
Leaving us with barely anything, right?
Pretty much just toxic options like colistin. But what makes NDM1 truly terrifying is that it lives on a plasmid. A plasmid is this free-floating piece of extrachromosomal DNA.
Oh, right. Think of a plasmid like a downloadable software update that bacteria can just pass back and forth to share resistance upgrades.
Exactly. And they don't even have to be the same species of bacteria to share it. This process is called conjugation. Bacteria literally connect to each other and transfer that plasmid DNA.
So they just hand over the resistance code.
Yes, especially among gram-negative bacteria. And conjugation often transfers multi-drug resistance all at once. A pathogen can even acquire resistance directly from the normal harmless flora living in your own body.
Oh, wow.
Which is much faster and more dangerous than spontaneous mutation, which is just a random, slow genetic change that usually only gives resistance to one single drug.
You know, there's a really common misconception I want to clear up for everyone listening, especially for when you're doing patient education. When a patient doesn't finish their prescription, the antibiotic isn't actively teaching the bacteria how to mutate, right?
Right. Antibiotics do not cause the genetic mutations. They aren't mutagenic. What they do is create selection pressure.
Okay, break that down for us.
When you administer an antibiotic, it quickly kills off all the highly sensitive, weak bacteria. That clears out all the competition for space and nutrients.
Leaving a giant buffet.
Exactly. It leaves a massive biological buffet for any highly resistant mutant bugs that just happen to be hanging around, allowing them to thrive and multiply completely unchecked. And broad-spectrum antibiotics are the worst offenders here.
Because they just indiscriminately wipe out the largest amount of competing bugs.
Precisely.
Well, if broad-spectrum drugs cause this much dangerous selection pressure in hospitals, what happens when we just dump millions of pounds of them into the environment? The box in the text on agricultural use is just staggering.
It really is. Nearly 80% of the antibiotics produced in the U.S. go to animals. And mostly for growth promotion, not even to treat active infections.
It's wild.
The biological mechanism is the exact same, just on a massive scale. For decades, poultry farmers used a drug called virginiamycin to make chickens grow faster.
Okay.
Recently, a vital human drug called Sinercid was developed to treat vancomycin-resistant Enterococcus faecium, a deadly hospital bug. But because the agricultural drug and the human drug are chemically so similar, chickens fed virginiamycin developed Sinercid-resistant bugs in their guts.
Wait, so we compromised a last resort human drug just to get cheaper poultry?
Yes. That resistance passes right to humans. And back in the clinical setting, this indiscriminate destruction of normal flora leads to superinfections.
Superinfections. That's a new infection appearing during treatment for a primary one, right?
Correct. If your patient is on a broad-spectrum antibiotic for a lung infection, that drug wipes out the healthy flora in their GI tract or reproductive tract. Without that normal flora keeping things in check, a secondary opportunistic bug, like vaginal candida, can suddenly flourish.
Okay, so if we know broad-spectrum drugs cause so much resistance and invite superinfections, why would a provider ever prescribe one initially? Why not just test the bug first and use a narrow-spectrum drug?
Well, the therapeutic objective is always maximum effect with minimal harm. Providers look at the identity of the organism, its drug sensitivity, and host factors. They always want the first choice drug because it's the narrowest spectrum.
But the real world isn't that simple.
Exactly. You will encounter severely ill patients where waiting 48 hours for a lab result could literally mean death. That is when empiric therapy is initiated.
It's like having to shoot first and ask questions later in an emergency. You just hit absolutely everything with a broad-spectrum weapon to ensure you catch the immediate threat.
Yes, but using that broad-spectrum drug comes with a massive nursing responsibility. The golden rule here, listen to this, is that samples of exudates and body fluids absolutely must be drawn for culture before the first drop of antibiotic touches the patient.
Wait, before the very first drop?
Yes. If you start the IV antibiotic first, that drug starts circulating and suppressing microbial growth in your patient's system. When the lab tries to grow the culture, nothing will grow.
Oh, because you basically destroyed the fingerprint. You destroyed the evidence you need to narrow down the right drug later, leaving the provider stuck using the dangerous broad-spectrum drug blindly.
Exactly. You ruined the sample.
Okay, so let's say you grab that culture properly. What actually happens in the lab? How do they figure out its weaknesses?
The quickest method is a microscopic examination of a gram stain. But for tiny amounts of bugs or viruses, they use PCR, a nucleic acid amplification test. It's highly sensitive and specific.
And once they identify it, do they always test to see what drugs kill it?
Not always. If it's a bug that rarely shows resistance, like group A strep, susceptibility testing isn't really necessary. But if it's something known for resistance, like Staph aureus, they have to test it.
How do they do that?
3 main methods. First is disc diffusion, or the Kirby-Bauer test. They drop paper discs soaked in antibiotics onto a bacteria-seeded agar plate. The diameter of the clear, bacteria-free zone around the disc shows the susceptibility.
Makes sense.
Second is serial dilution. Bacteria are grown in tubes with varying drug concentrations. This gives us the MIC, the minimum inhibitory concentration, and the MBC, the minimum bactericidal concentration.
Okay, let me make sure I have this straight for the students. If I'm looking at a chart, the MIC tells me the exact lowest dose needed to hit pause on the bacteria. Right. And the MBC tells me the exact lowest dose to hit delete and actually kill 99.9% of it.
That is the perfect clinical distinction. And the third method, gradient diffusion, uses a test strip with a built-in concentration gradient on an agar plate to give a highly precise visual reading of the MIC, exactly where the growth stops.
So we get these lab results back, we match the bug to the drug.
Yeah.
But the lab isn't a human body. How do the patient's unique characteristics, the host factors, change things?
The most crucial host factor is the patient's immune system. As we said, antibiotics work in concert with host defenses. If you have a severely immunocompromised patient, bacteriostatic drugs will completely fail.
Because they don't have the immune cells to do the cleanup.
Exactly. The only hope there is rapidly bactericidal drugs. Also, the physical side of infection matters immensely. Drugs really struggle to cross the blood-brain barrier for meningitis.
Yeah, right.
They have a hard time penetrating heart vegetations and endocarditis, and they cannot easily enter purulent abscesses, which are basically walled-off pockets of thick pus with no internal blood supply.
So IV drugs just literally can't reach the bacteria inside.
Right. They usually require surgical drainage first.
What about foreign materials in the body, like pacemakers or synthetic joints?
They present a massive hurdle. In the presence of a foreign body, the patient's phagocytes act incredibly strangely. They get entirely obsessed with attacking the foreign object, the pacemaker, and exhaust themselves.
That is fascinating. The phagocytes act like distracted security guards. They get so obsessed with yelling at the parked car that they completely ignore the burglars sneaking right past them.
That's exactly it. And often the only cure is surgically removing the pacemaker. You also have to consider genetic factors, like G6PD deficiency causing severe hemolysis with sulfonamides.
Let's actually break down the lifespan considerations, too, because treating an infant is wildly different from treating an older adult.
Oh, completely. Infants have poorly developed kidney and liver function. For example, giving sulfonamides to a newborn can cause kernicterus, a severe neurologic disorder. The drug displaces bilirubin, which then crosses their immature blood-brain barrier.
And in young children, we have to worry about tetracyclines.
Yes, tetracyclines bind tightly to calcium in developing teeth, causing permanent dark discoloration.
Wow. And what about pregnancy?
Drugs like gentamicin cause irreversible hearing loss in the fetus. Sulfonamides enter breast milk, so they're out for breastfeeding patients. And for older adults, naturally reduced metabolism and excretion mean we often have to lower dosages to prevent severe toxicity.
Okay, so now that the specific drug is chosen for this specific patient, how do we administer it safely? Let's talk dosage, duration, and combinations.
For dosage, drug levels generally need to stay 4 to 8 times the MIC. But for duration, this is the most vital patient teaching you will do. Never discontinue prematurely.
Right, because patients stop the second they feel better.
And stopping early causes relapses with highly resistant organisms because the ones that survived the first few days were the strongest.
Makes sense. What about combining antibiotics? Isn't hitting an infection with 2 drugs always better than 1?
Actually, routine use of multiple drugs is strongly discouraged. They interact in 3 ways. Additive means the effect is the sum of the 2. Potentiative, or synergistic, means the effect is way greater than the sum.
Okay, those sound good.
But antagonistic is highly dangerous. That's when a combination is less effective than one drug acting alone.
Wait, if I give a bacteriostatic drug that freezes the bacteria and another bactericidal drug that only targets actively dividing bacteria,
Yes.
they literally cancel each other out, that is a mind-blowing light bulb moment.
Yes.
That's why polypharmacy without a plan is so dangerous.
Exactly. You never combine a drug that halts growth with one that requires active growth. Now, there are valid reasons for combinations, like severe unknown infections, mixed infections, or decreasing toxicity like using flucytosine with amphotericin B so you can lower the dose of the highly toxic amphotericin.
But combinations also bring higher costs and superinfection risks.
They do. And keep in mind, a massive chunk, 30 to 50% of antibiotics in the U.S. are used for prophylaxis or prevention.
Oh, like giving them before certain surgeries.
Right. Given before cardiac, GI, or hysterectomy surgeries, or to prevent bacterial endocarditis or protect patients with severe neutropenia.
Since we know all these strict rules, it is genuinely shocking to look at the real-world misuse data in the chapter. The CDC says 50% of antibiotic prescriptions are inappropriate.
50%. The worst misuse is treating viral infections like the common cold. The stats are stark. Only 1 in 4,000 patients actually benefit, but 1 in 4 get diarrhea, 1 in 50 get a rash, and 1 in 1,000 end up in the ER with an allergy.
You know, when a patient demands an antibiotic for a cold, they think it's just a harmless just-in-case measure. But as a nurse, you can now explain that they're rolling the dice on severe diarrhea or an ER visit for literally 0 benefit.
Exactly. Another misuse is treating a fever of unknown origin. Unless the patient is severely immunocompromised, giving antibiotics just masks the true diagnosis like cancer or hepatitis and exposes them to needless toxicity.
So true.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a thought-provoking concept building on this chapter. Consider the arms race of pharmacology. Every single time we synthesize a new class of antibiotics, we are simultaneously, inevitably putting a ticking clock on its lifespan.
Because of that selection pressure.
Exactly. It really forces us to ask, are we treating the diseases of today by borrowing against the cures of tomorrow?
Wow. That is a heavy but incredibly vital perspective to carry onto the floor with you. The magic bullet is really only magic until the armor evolves. Well, we've successfully unpacked Linus Chapter 88, from mechanism all the way to bedside care. From all of us at the Last Minute Lecture team, thank you for learning with us. Good luck on your exams, and we'll see you on the floor.